Today I'm presenting a conversation I had with Stephen Laureys, who is a Belgian neuroscientist and neurologist. He has a clinical practice as well. And he's engaged in a lot of fascinating research, which we don't actually talk about. That will be left for a future conversation. This time around, he wanted to interview me for a book he's doing, and he wanted to talk about meditation. And as the conversation got into some interesting detail, I thought many of you would like to hear it. So this is me being interviewed about meditation, what it is and why one would do it, how it can help us understand the mind scientifically, and the ways in which it can't. And now I bring you Stephen Laureys. I am here with Stephen Laureys. Stephen, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Sam.
So, Stephen, you're working on a book, and you wanted to talk about meditation and consciousness and related things, and so I'm happy to do it and happy to go wherever you want to lead.
Thank you for that. Yes, indeed. I actually wrote a book. I was invited to do so by a Flemish small publishing company, and it is about my personal experience, and then as a neuroscientist, how we study the brain of these Buddhist monks, and how as a neurologist, I now actually prescribe meditation. And it turned out to do very well. It was then translated in French and other languages, and now it's coming out in English. And so I'm very, very happy to have your testimony and how, when, and why you started to meditate.
Nice. Just so my listeners know, so you're a neuroscientist and a neurologist. So you have clinical practice now, or you're in your hospital?
Yes, right. I'm in the University Hospital of Liège. I'm an MD, a neurologist. Our area of expertise actually is the damaged brain. So I created the Coma Science Group and now had the Giga Consciousness Research Unit, where we try then from a scientific point of view, basically to understand human consciousness, which, as you know, is one of the biggest mysteries for science to solve. And we do that not only by looking at patients who have a severe acquired brain damage after trauma or hemorrhage, or survivors of cardiac arrest. So that's coma and related states, also near-death experiences. But then we also have a lab looking at what happens in your brain and mind when you are anesthetized, when you're giving these narcotic drugs or psychedelic drugs for that matter. And finally, we have a strong tradition here and a whole lab looking at hypnosis and its medical use. We have over 10,000 patients who had surgeries, like taking out your thyroid or a tumor in the breast, where anywhere you would have general anesthesia or pharmacological coma. But here people are undergoing this intervention while basically thinking about their holidays and in this hypnotic state.
Wow. You've had thousands of people have surgery without anesthesia under hypnosis?
Yes.
Wow.
So this is a wonderful woman who's called Marie-Lise Femonville, who's an anesthesiologist, and she's really a pioneer who introduced hypnosis. And as you know, this is, what we know from television and theater, doing tricks. But it's also something that illustrates, I think, again, the power of the mind and how, as she has shown, you can use this in the operating room during surgery, but also now in the pain clinic. So that's what we do with the team. But talking about meditation for me is something it's out of my comfort zone. It's not something that I would have predicted 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, so I'm happy to get into it with you. So I think your first question was how I got into it, and it was, in my case, and this is really not unusual, my interest was first precipitated by a drug experience. In my case, it was MDMA, otherwise known as ecstasy. And I think I was 18, And I had an experience there which was not what's the all too common one now. I wasn't at a rave or a party. It wasn't really a recreational use of that drug. I took it knowing its potential to reveal something interesting about the nature of my mind, and I took it very much in the spirit of investigating my mind and seeing what transformative experiences might be on the other side of my ordinary waking consciousness. And so the experience itself wasn't so directly relevant to what I later came to consider the true purpose of meditation, but it revealed for me the fact that it was possible to have a very different experience of myself and the world and my sense of my being in the world, and just it was possible to have a much better life than I was going to have by just living out the implications of my own conditioning and tendencies at that point. So it set me on this path of self-inquiry, really, where I then, explicitly studied techniques of meditation to try to explore the landscape of mind further, directly through introspection. And I've taken other psychedelics since, and so psychedelics have been a part of this, but they are separable. I mean, perhaps you want to talk about that, but there's no question that, but for that initial experience, it seems pretty likely that I may never have grown interested in meditation or anything like it.
So the when was you were 18 years old,
Mm-hmm.
curious, and then taking these drugs to kind of explore changes in self perception, and then you turn to meditation, and what kinds of meditation did you try?
I had been given a book by Ram Dass, who originally was named Richard Alpert, and he was, along with Timothy Leary, led some of those initial experiments at Harvard in the 60s, studying LSD, and was also fired from Harvard along with Tim Leary for their misadventures in handing out LSD to all comers. Many people know his story. He went to India. He met his teacher. He came back with a very long beard and in a dress, calling himself Ram Dass, and he then was a kind of spiritual teacher for many, many years. He only recently died, and so this was 87. I sat my first meditation retreat with him, and there he was teaching an eclectic mix of practices. I mean, it was really a kind of buffet of spirituality, but part of it was Buddhist meditation, in particular Vipassana or mindfulness meditation. And that was the practice I'm most connected with on that retreat. And then I went on to sit, explicitly Buddhist Vipassana retreats, in silence after that, and spent a lot of time studying with my friend Joseph Goldstein, who was one of my first Vipassana teachers, and sat with his teacher, Sayadaw U Pandita, a Burmese meditation master, and then eventually migrated away from strict Vipassana for some reasons I think we'll probably talk about, just the logic of the practice and the kind of goal seeking that was built into it eventually seemed mistaken to me, or at least unnecessary, and also a source of a fair amount of striving and psychological suffering. And then I connected with so-called non-dual practices, both within and outside of Buddhism, and that did change. It did significantly shift my approach to meditation, but that took a few years to happen. So there were several years there where I was mostly, never exclusively, but certainly mostly practicing, what people in the West know as mindfulness now, but very much under a kind of Burmese Theravada Buddhist influence, and then migrated to the Tibetan practice of Dzogchen, but also influenced by some teachers and teachings I encountered outside of Buddhism. And and so all of that during my 20s, that absorbed a fair amount of time. I spent about 2 years on silent retreat in the decade of my 20s, and had dropped out of school, and wasn't quite sure how I was going to integrate all of these things. And then only after that decade did I return to school and get a PhD in neuroscience and begin to get all of my interests aligned. And it's taken some time, but now I'm in a position to have the kinds of conversations I want to have about the nature of the mind and what can be understood about it or not based on first-person methods like meditation.
Wow. So, how would you define these non-dual practices, and how they differ from mindfulness?
I think it's best understood, certainly by anyone who has tried to meditate, by describing the usual starting point for the practice of meditation. So someone decides they want to meditate, and they're taught a method, and this can be mindfulness. This can be some other method like transcendental meditation, mantra meditation. It could be a visualization practice. It can be any use of their attention. But most of us start that project from a specific point of view. I mean, people tend to close their eyes, and if it's ordinary mindfulness practice, they might be told to focus on the breath. And so if you close your eyes and you try to pay attention to your breath, most people will feel that their consciousness, their awareness, is a kind of a locus of attention in the head. They're paying attention from someplace, and it's very likely in their head, behind their eyes, and they can aim their attention at the object of meditation. So if they're aiming their attention at the breath, whether at the tip of the nose or in the rising and falling of their chest or abdomen, there's this sense of being a subject in the head that can now strategically pay attention to something. And of course, that the real obstacle to doing this successfully is distraction, getting lost in thought. And so thoughts are continually arising, and you're getting pulled away from the object of meditation, and then you bring your attention back to the breath or to sounds or to a visualization or a mantra, whatever you're focusing on. And as concentration builds, this can become more and more successful, right? So you can actually attention can rest on the object of meditation for longer periods of time. And if you're practicing mindfulness, you can get good enough so that you can even notice thoughts arising as objects in consciousness rather than just be merely taken away by them in each moment. And many interesting changes in one's states of mind and emotion can happen here. But if you're practicing dualistically, it more or less always feels like there's a meditator, there's a subject who is paying attention. There's the subject, which is the source of awareness itself, and then there's the object of awareness, whether it's the breath or a sound or whatever. And that point of view, that duality, that subject-object perception, is an illusion. I mean, and it is the primary illusion that meditation is designed to cut through. And if you're practicing really well in this dualistic way, that will occasionally happen, and it may happen a fair amount. I mean, it can happen if you go on retreat and you do nothing but meditate for 12 to 18 hours a day, and your mindfulness gets very continuous and effortless. You can find that this subject-object distance collapses again and again and again, and so you'll hear a sound, for instance, and in that brief moment of just the impingement of the sound on your eardrum, you might notice that there is no sense of one who is hearing the sound. There's just hearing. There's no you in the head listening to a bird out there. There's just this ineffable appearance of hearing that is unified. The subject drops away and the object drops away, really, and there's just kind of the unity of knowing and its appearances. But again, it's haphazard. You don't have any control over it. When it stops happening, you're left thinking, oh, that was interesting. How do I get back to that? And it seems under that way of practicing that the only way back to that is to once again summon this heroic level of concentration and continuity of mindfulness And what non-dual paths of practice have understood is that there really is a fundamental illusion to cut through there. It really is not the case that you need massive sustained concentration to get to this experience of unity or non-duality. In fact, it's already the case in every moment of consciousness. I mean, consciousness itself doesn't feel like a center in the head. It doesn't feel like a spotlight of attention being aimed at its objects. There is no self in the head or thinker of thoughts. There's just this open condition in which everything is appearing, and it can be recognized as such directly. And so it's that recognition that really is the starting point of non-dual practice, a practice like Dzogchen. And really you can't begin practicing it until you recognize that this is the way consciousness already is. But once you do, then your mindfulness becomes synonymous with that recognition. So what you become mindful of thereafter is not the breath or sounds or anything else per se, though you may in fact be aware of the breath or sounds or whatever happens to be appearing. What you become mindful of is that there's no subject in the middle of consciousness. The practice itself becomes simply familiarizing yourself with this intrinsic property of consciousness that you basically had spent every moment of your life overlooking, prior to learning how to practice in that way. And so that is the difference. I mean, again, it's somewhat paradoxical to talk about and can be confusing to many people, but I think most people realize that, whether they're trying to meditate or not, they do feel like a subject. They don't feel identical to their experience. They feel like they're at the center of their experience. They're having an experience. They're appropriating it from a place in the head. And that's the central illusion that is cut through in non-dual practice.
Thanks. So we briefly discussed the when and the how, and you mentioned the why, curiosity, as I understood, and also mentioned to try and live a better life. Can you say a little bit more why you continue to meditate, and what are your current favorite exercises?
Well, so the why, there are really two whys, which can be more or less important for people. I mean, the most common why, though, the why that is certainly advocated by the Buddhist tradition generally, isn't really intellectual curiosity. It's much more a matter of overcoming suffering. We all feel unhappy to one or another degree in our lives. It's not to say that happiness doesn't come, but it also goes. You just can't stay joyful all the time, and if you just wait long enough, you'll feel frustrated and annoyed and angry and sad and fearful, and just there's a lot of psychological pain that most of us experience fairly regularly. And meditation is offered as a method of having some fundamental insights into that process such that you don't keep suffering to the same degree and in all the ordinary ways. And it certainly holds out the promise that it might be possible, in some sense, not to suffer at all, to actually fully escape the logic by which you tend to make yourself miserable. And it has a lot to do with having insight into the nature of thought itself and breaking one's identification with thought. I mean, so much of our psychological suffering is mediated by our thinking about the past and the future, and in failing to connect with the present because we're thinking so much and not noticing that we're lost in thought. So yeah, my motivation, while it was always somewhat intellectual as well, it certainly was primarily about living a better life in the sense of just not suffering unnecessarily and just actually being happier, recovering from the ordinary collisions in life that cause psychological pain, recovering more quickly. And I think that certainly is the most common motivation. And, for me, both of these motivations continue what's changed for me is that it's not so much a sense of practicing deliberately anymore. I mean, occasionally, I do sit and meditate, but it's much more a sense of always practicing in that my moment to moment experience is always being punctuated by, what I would call meditation. I mean, what would qualify as meditation if I happen to be, formally in a session of meditation, which is to say a recognition of the way consciousness is. And it happens automatically. It doesn't happen all the time. It's, I spend an impressive amount of time still lost in thought. But when I'm not lost in thought, the thing that I become aware of is this non-duality of subject and object in consciousness. Figure and ground have flipped here a little bit, which is, in the beginning, I was trying to get to this experience, and meditation was a formal attempt to do that. Initially, it was haphazard, and then I was doing it more or less on demand. But now there's much more of a sense of, this is the way consciousness is, and much of normal life is my inadvertently overlooking that. But when I no longer overlook it, in any given moment, it is what I'm restored to. It no longer feels like a practice of any kind. In fact, it's, when one is actually, really meditating, one isn't doing something. One is doing less than one normally does. It's simply the absence of distraction. Once you know what to pay attention to, it is simply the absence of being lost in thought for that moment.
Mm-hmm. And were you suffering as an 18-year-old? Were you in a crisis, that decade of dropout? What's your personal story there?
Well, I had had many experiences of intense suffering, but completely ordinary, nothing extraordinary, just completely ordinary sorts of suffering that people experience in life. But I'd had them as a teenager. When I was 13, my best friend died. When I was 17, my father died. When I was 18, just proximate to this experience with MDMA, my girlfriend had broken up with me in college in her freshman year. These are very ordinary experiences. Now, I mean, some people don't have anyone die until they're a little bit older than I was, but if you just wait around, people are going to start dying on you. And so, I was not living in a civil war, or, I mean, there was nothing unusual happening in my life. I had a very lucky life at that point, all things considered. But, those experiences hit me really hard. I was really unhappy. For instance, after my girlfriend broke up with me in college, I was probably in some kind of clinical state of depression for several months after that. I was not myself. And it was because I was thinking incessantly about what I had lost, right? I mean, I was meditating on loss and loneliness and grief, and had absolutely no insight into this process. I mean, I was just a mere puppet being blown around by whatever this next train of thought would be, right? And that's everyone's condition. I mean, if you do not see an alternative to being identified with the next linguistic or imagistic appearance in your mind, I mean, the next emotionally laden statement that, seems to appear in the voice of your own mind, whether it's self-judgment or something that produces anxiety or something that produces sadness over a loss you've suffered. If there's no space around this automaticity of thought, there's no alternative but to be living out the emotional implications of whatever the thought happens to be. And most of us, most of the time, have, at best, mediocre thoughts. We're not tending to tell ourselves a story about how good life is, how grateful we are for all that we have, how beautiful the people in our lives are, and how lucky we are to be with them. I mean, you can decide to shape your thoughts along very deliberately wholesome lines that will improve your mood. And that's a totally useful practice that is, very much supportive of mindfulness and these other practices we're talking about. But most of us don't tend to do that automatically. Most of us think about all of our disappointments. We notice everything that's wrong. We have a long list of things we wish would happen. So we tend to be captured by a story of deficiency, right? Things are not yet good enough. And we're telling ourselves a story that if only we could change these things about our lives, if only I could get another girlfriend, right? If only I could meet somebody. That was almost certainly a story I was telling myself at that point. Or if only I could get back to the girlfriend who broke up with me. That self-talk seems to promise something which proves to be a mirage. This idea that if we could only arrange our lives perfectly, there would be a good enough reason for attention to truly rest in the present moment and be satisfied. But unless you have a mind that is capable of that, that's not what happens. I mean, you get what you want and you find that you simply want other things at that point. And again, your happiness appears to be contingent upon satisfying those desires. I'm not saying it's not better to get what you want than to have just one disappointment after the next. I mean, yes, there are ordinary sources of pleasure and happiness in this life, but none of them are durable sources of happiness. All of these contingent sources of happiness need to be continually propped up by our efforts. They all tend to degrade. And, you accomplish one goal, and no matter how, wonderful an experience it is to do that, it doesn't take 15 minutes before people are asking you, what are you going to do next, right? I mean, nothing gets finely banked as the foundation upon which you can rest and be happy, every moment thereafter. So meditation is the practice of understanding something about the mechanics of this dissatisfaction and this search for happiness, and to deliberately step off the hamster wheel here. I mean, just to see that, if you're running on this wheel, on some level, you're not getting anywhere. And the only way to truly come to rest is to step off it.
That resonates with my own experience. You mentioned your crisis, losing your best friend, your father, girlfriend. It seems quite often the case that we seemingly need these difficult moments to go and discover things like meditation. It's also what I see in my outpatient clinics, and maybe that's a pity. People actually tell me it's a pity. I had, I had this burnout or depression or whatever, and I wished I would have discovered meditation before that. So strangely, it's something that is, I think, also maybe with your community and your app, is something that you must often hear, that people come to this because they don't feel or go well, and maybe we should invest more in prevention and talk about this before we what do you think about that?
Again, it's difficult to talk about because it is somewhat paradoxical. I mean, this is the line one continually walks in describing meditation and its benefits, because it's not that nothing else matters, right? It's not that there aren't ordinary requisites for happiness that you want to recommend to people. I mean, yes, it is good to have good relationships. Being integrated in a community and having people you love and who love you, who can support you, and who you in turn support. I mean, all of that is, for most people, most of the time, a necessary component of being a happy person. And yet, there is an illusion here. It's not stable, and all of that is made better by discovering that the true foundation for psychological well-being doesn't rest on even those relationships. To have the best relationship, to have the best marriage, on some level, you really need to already be happy. You need to bring into that relationship not your need for companionship, but your ability to simply love the other person, right? It's not transactional. It's not, I'll love you if you love me. It's, you're already happy and you deeply want happiness for this other person. You're not extracting something from them for your own benefit, though you are getting a lot of benefit by being with them, but the center of gravity of your well-being is already, over your own feet. I mean, where you stand. You're not leaning into them in a way that makes the whole enterprise precarious. But again, this is paradoxical, because I wouldn't want to say that it's not important to have the other person, but there's no question that relationships get healthier and healthier the more you, on some level, can be just as happy when you're alone in a room. When the one you love leaves the room, you're not diminished by that. And there's kind of two levels at which we can seek well-being. And one level is to continue to do all the things that matter or seem to matter for most people most of the time. So yes, it's better to be healthy than sick. It's better to be comfortable than uncomfortable. It's better to have financial resources than to not have them. And all of these things remain true. And yet the deeper truth is you're only going to be as happy as you can be based on what you're doing with your attention in each moment. And if you're just habitually lost in thought and thinking, crappy thoughts about what just happened to you on social media, whatever the actual character of your life, you're not in a position to enjoy it. And it is, in fact, also true that there are people whose minds are such that they can be deeply happy even in conditions that would drive most people totally crazy. I've studied with people who spent, decades in caves just meditating, right? You put the average person in a cave and separate him or her from everything they want out of life and everything they love in this world, and they'll go insane. And they'll go insane based on an inability to pay attention in a very specific way. Again, there's something paradoxical here, but the paradox is resolved by our doing both sets of wise things simultaneously. You want to have a good life. You want to do work you find meaningful. You want to participate in the world in ways that are fun and creative and connect you to other people. And you want to recognize this thing about the nature of your own mind.
In my book, I argue for meditation courses in school. Maybe just the way we have specific teachers teaching, giving physical education, and it's important to take care of our body. But I feel we neglect the emotional well-being in our educational system. There's wonderful things happening, but nothing structurally, at least not in Europe. But I don't think it's the case in the States, that still education is very much about acquiring knowledge, and maybe we could and should do better. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, this is something my wife, Annika, has focused on a lot. She's taught mindfulness in schools, both the school that my daughters go to and other schools for some years. And yeah, it's amazing. Kids can really learn this. I think probably 6 years old is about the earliest you can profitably start. But yeah, I mean, kids can learn to initially simply become more aware of what they're feeling. A 6-year-old who can recognize specific emotions clearly and see how they motivate him or her to behave in certain ways, that's an amazing skill to teach. And I mean, it's the first step toward the primary value of living an examined life that, was so central to Western philosophy for, at least 1,000 years or so. And then we lost it in the West. I mean, this is why so many people like myself have gravitated toward Eastern traditions to at least initially to learn these techniques, because the value of wisdom as opposed to mere knowledge, is something that it's not that it ever completely disappeared in the West, but it got genuinely submerged by other priorities. And it has been the case for now centuries that if you're a Western philosopher, that carries absolutely no implication that you're doing something that entails living a better life, right? I mean, there need be no connection between philosophy and well-being or living an ethical life, being a benign person at a minimum in this world. And so you can have some of the great philosophers of the Western canon who were just, almighty neurotics and, toxic people. And that says nothing derogatory about their philosophy, right? So you have someone like Nietzsche or Schopenhauer. I mean, just, Schopenhauer threw his housekeeper down a flight of stairs. Wittgenstein, who just, would beat pupils and treat his colleagues terribly. These are not people to emulate in terms of how they lived their lives. Obviously, each of these were brilliant men and can be profitably read for their thoughts about other topics, but there was an important bifurcation between what philosophy became in the West and its original purpose, which was to understand something about the nature of being in the world such that it transforms your capacities as a person. It transforms the actual moment-to-moment texture of your life. So we have largely lost that. I think the fact that even now it's really an afterthought, or we're just, it's appearing as a kind of new discovery that maybe we should be teaching children something about how to be such that they become happier, wiser, more ethical people. And I think that's the most important project we have. And it seems strange that we don't even discuss it for the most part at any point in our education system, and then just rely on people to figure it out for themselves once they become grown-ups.
Absolutely. It strikes me even more as a caregiver. I'm supposed to take care of others, but actually throughout my studies at university, medical school, and then specializing neurology, never ever have learned anything about taking care of myself and listening to my own emotions. And in we know caregivers are at risk for burnout. I have 2 colleagues who committed suicide. We know this for such a long time, and still so little is happening, structurally speaking, in our faculty, in our educational system. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's another point there, which is, we've all met doctors who are, maybe brilliant physicians. I mean, they've certainly, in my experience, been recommended to me as brilliant physicians who have terrible bedside manners. They're in no sense a healing presence as a person. And so you're coming to them essentially for their expertise as physicians, as, diagnosticians or, people who could recommend a course of treatment, or they might be brilliant surgeons, right? So this is actually the pair of hands you want operating if it comes to that. But, these are people who are just on some level canceling, whatever healing benefits there might be of actually connecting with a wise and compassionate physician because of who they seem to be, in their own skins as people. I don't know what they teach in medical school about how to be with patients, but obviously the profession of being a doctor selects for a range of personality types, and I'm sure that the various specialties further select, right? So you're somewhat at the mercy of the personality that shows up there. And again, yeah, it would be better if there was a more holistic understanding of just what it means to be in that role. right? Because it's, I mean, you're dealing, again, and I'm not speaking from experience, I'm really just speaking as a consumer of medicine, but, you know, depending on what specialty you're in, you're encountering people very often in the most vulnerable, anxiety-ridden, or even grief-stricken moments of their lives. And it matters what sort of person you are in those moments.
Absolutely. In my field of expertise, seeing patients after coma and their families, and a lot of people die, yeah, it is a big challenge to do the job with empathy and compassion. And as you said, we were not selected for that. We had no particular courses, and that is a pity. Speaking of that, and in my job again, I see death on a daily basis. And how did meditation change your relationship with death?
Well, it's certainly traditional to frame the project of meditation and spiritual practice generally, contemplative practice, very much in the context of getting ready to die on some level. It's like this is part of the explicit project, which is, death is inevitable, and we spend most of our lives by default, materially avoiding it for obvious reasons, but also avoiding thinking about it. I mean, this is the whole notion of death denial, which I think has a lot to it. And there's a wonderful book by that title, The Denial of Death by Ernst Becker. We try to distract ourselves from this ever-present reality, and many of us manage to do that rather well, right? I mean, there are people who don't think about death all that much because they're so busy trying to have a good time in life. And I mean, I would say that, by tendency, I've always been a person who has not been able to forget about death for very long, right? This is probably due to the fact that I did lose a few people close to me, fairly early on. So, it was always obvious to me, or at least, from 13 onward, it was quite obvious to me that this was a reality and this could happen at any time. There are no guarantees that you're going to live a long life. And so it's something that I've always kept in front of me as a fact. I mean, I think more than the average person. And meditation is a further way of doing that. I mean, it's a way of extracting the wisdom of doing that, rather than merely being made morbid by one's awareness of death. It's a method of recognizing just how much there is to be grateful for. You haven't died yet. Your life is right here to be enjoyed, and it can only be enjoyed by you, right? I mean, this corner of the universe that is illuminated where you sit, only you get to make the most of that. And how you pay attention to it, it really is the most important piece of that. I mean, it's not really, making the most of it isn't in the end radically changing what is already the case there. I mean, it's really being able to sink into the experience of being in the world more and more and enjoy it in relationship to other people, enjoy it in relationship to the natural beauty of the world, enjoy it by behaving more and more ethically, enjoy it by having better and better intentions with respect to your collaboration with other people, and enjoying the quality of mind born of those good intentions, right? I mean, rather than seeing yourself in competition with others, actually wanting other people to succeed and feeling good when they succeed, rather than feeling like your happiness has been somehow diminished by, someone got a slice of the pie that you wanted. I mean, using all of that to come to rest more and more in the present moment. I mean, I really do see that as the project. And an awareness of death is, apart from just being in contact with reality, right? I mean, this is coming for all of us. It is the backstop that keeps you from just wasting all of your time and attention. Without an awareness of death, I don't know, I think it would be possible to just distract yourself as pleasantly as you could muster always, right? And have kind of no deeper priorities. There really is something good about being aware of death, but unless you can find that and use that it is easy to just feel like it's a source of unhappiness. I mean, every time you think about death, you feel like, okay, that's no place to linger, and I just want to. The project now is to forget about it, and I think that's a misuse of the actual opportunity.
You've referred a number of times to the Buddhist tradition, and how do you deal with their belief in life after death as a famous and strong atheist?
Hmm. Yeah, the truth is, I don't really deal with it. I think I'm, in truth, just agnostic as to what happens after death because I'm aware that we don't understand how consciousness emerges, at what point it emerges out of the physical complexity of the world. Is there a computational account of consciousness that makes it absolutely clear that when the brain dies, that's it? As you know, I think anyone would be on firm ground being biased toward that kind of view, right? I think you're not going to embarrass yourself among scientists or philosophers at this point by thinking that, the death of the brain is the end of consciousness in the case of any person. But it's not clear what consciousness is or how it's emerging, or even that it does emerge. We can't even rule out panpsychism at this moment, although, we can't really rule it in either, and it may be unfalsifiable. So I don't spend much time thinking about that either. So for me, nothing in my life is predicated on an expectation about what happens after death, apart from the certainty that I'll be separated from everything familiar that I'm enjoying while alive. That much is clear. There's no good reason to think you'll be reunited with everyone you love after death. That would be obviously a miracle that would be very difficult to understand. And whatever happens after death, this life really is as precious as it appears. The traditional, Abrahamic conceptions of heaven, I mean, I guess there's not a very clear one in the Jewish tradition, but, among Christians and Muslims, the idea that you just, you kind of fly off the brain with your personality intact and you land in some kind of paradise if you were good, or in some hell realm if you were bad, or rather, if you believed the right or wrong things. It really doesn't relate to whether you're good or bad, as we know, unfortunately. So that view clearly makes no sense. But whether there's something more bizarre that may continue, I just don't know. I mean, there are certain experiences many of us have had, either in meditation or on psychedelics, can give motivation to the sense that the mind is far stranger than it seems in everyday waking consciousness. But, whether that strangeness has any implications for what happens after death, I don't know.
Because what you mentioned about the subject-object collapse and this kind of pure experience during meditation, but also when you take these psychedelic drugs, is also what we hear in people who survive their coma or life-threatening condition and have a near-death experience. So this is something that we've been studying for past 10 years now here with the Coma Science Group, and we have nearly 2,000 of these fascinating testimonies. Again, it's a subject that, as was the case for consciousness itself, was considered a taboo, and we did some auto censorship there, which is a pity, but maybe it would be interesting, and that's actually what we're trying to do, comparing these subjective experiences. And if you permit, Sam, maybe I can ask anyone listening to this who had such an experience to share it with us. There's a couple of people here doing their PhD and postdocs. So share it with us. NDE from Near Death Experience, NDE at Liège from University of Liège.be, because I think it's fascinating. And in your experience, do you think it as a neuroscientist then helps you to understand the basis of consciousness?
Well, I'm not sure anything helps us understand the basis of consciousness yet, right? I'm convinced that the hard problem of consciousness is in fact quite hard. And so, the short answer is no, meditation doesn't help resolve the hard problem. In fact, you can't even tell that you have a brain when you're meditating, much less that it has some involvement in producing the mind as you know it or consciousness itself. So that, some of the, traditional limitations of introspection are there kind of obvious, right? And it's not that meditation gives you the ability to bypass all of those, reasons to be skeptical about the utility of introspection in developing a science of the mind. But it does give you a clearer sense than I think most people would otherwise have that consciousness itself is conceptually irreducible. There are many people who think about consciousness in science and in philosophy who seem to manage to bypass the intuitions that motivate the hard problem. The hard problem, just to remind people, most people listening probably are aware of it, but it is this intuition that there's something left unexplained here. When you talk about a physical system like a brain accomplishing all that it does, information processing, perception, behavioral output, it clearly can do that, or it certainly seems to do much of that without any attendant conscious experience. It certainly seems that most of what the brain is doing is not illuminated by this qualitative experience of subjectivity, and yet it's doing all of these things. An example I would often give in a context like this, because I'm speaking, is that I'm not aware really of how I'm speaking. There are all these events happening in my nervous system that are required to accomplish this task of my producing these small mouth noises that amount to coherent speech. And, on your side, if you're listening to this, you are effortlessly and unconsciously parsing this stream of noise. And, if you speak English, you are comprehending what I'm saying, and it's just not clear at all how this is happening, right? And it's not attended by any kind of qualitative experience. So when there are mistakes made, when I misspeak, when I fail to get to the end of a sentence in grammatically correct form, or I struggle to find a word, or I use the wrong word, or all of those glitches in speech, again, I can be detecting them. There's something that it's like to be me noticing them, but they're happening based on a process that I cannot inspect really at all. And so much of the mind is like that. And so much of what the brain is doing is like that. The mystery is, why isn't it all like that? Why would anything be associated with conscious experience? And that remains mysterious no matter how much you describe the mechanics of any one of these processes, no matter how much we drill down on, the specific events at the level of synapses in the brain that account for, linguistic processing or, vision or emotion or any form of behavior, anything that a human being does or can seem to be doing when viewed from the outside. No matter how many details you pile up about that account for the mechanics of those processes, they never answer this fundamental question. Why should there be something that is like to be that part of the process, right? And yet many people in our field, both philosophers of mind and neuroscientists, seem to blow past this impasse without noticing that they've done it. And they more or less say they don't feel that there's a problem here intellectually at all. Once we get a complete explanation of the mechanics of things, that will be what consciousness is, right? And what meditation can give you is a deeper sense of how nonsensical that seems. I'm not saying, well, we can never get a physical understanding of consciousness. I mean, it may in fact be the case that consciousness is just some pattern of information processing in the brain that can be, more or less completely described. But the hard problem remains the fact that there just simply is no evidence of consciousness as it is in itself, apart from consciousness as it is in itself. We would never be tempted to wonder about consciousness, but for the fact that we feel it directly and experience it directly on our own side. And so meditation makes that more and more vivid, but again, that presents as a kind of impasse to understanding rather than something that facilitates it.
I'm surprised, and I would disagree that we could not learn from meditation and the experience. Maybe the code of consciousness, where indeed our ignorance is just so enormous that for me it's difficult to talk about hard or easy problems. It's just a problem. But to me, meditation was and is interesting, both from a personal and clinical perspective, but then also as a scientist interested in consciousness. I think it's a pity I didn't experience it before, because I do believe there's a huge difference between our theoretical knowledge about whatever, here cognition or perception, and then actually having this experience. And that was for me obvious when discussing with these Buddhist monks or the Dalai Lama, but also with hypnosis that we study, or psychedelics. I mean, I think you can read about how psychedelics work, and you can talk to people who took it. And then, as you and I know, I was in an MRI scanner and having psilocybin, magic mushrooms, having it injected in my veins, really was very different from anything I read or talked about with others. So I think the experiences and then linking, you and I, we use functional MRI, but then of course we can't make any sense of these images if we don't bridge the gap to the subjective phenomenology and the neurophenomenology that maybe we've neglected again for too long. What do you think?
So I think I took a far too narrow answer to your question, because I don't think it helps resolve what I'm calling the hard problem here, but I do think it's relevant to certainly most of the easy problems, right? So if you're talking about understanding the character of conscious experience, there we are really dependent on the quality of people's first-person reports about what it's like to be having those experiences, right? So if you put someone in a neuroimaging scanner and give them a task, I mean, some work obviously can be done just based on their behavioral outputs, but in so many paradigms, we are dependent on first-person report for the phenomenon we're studying, right? So if you want to know the difference between feeling happy and sad, right, or feeling envious of somebody, right? I mean, we always have recourse to people's subjective ratings of what it's like to be them. And insofar as people are terrible witnesses of what it's like to be them, because they're distracted every moment of the day, meditation offers a real path for us to find better observers of their own minds, such that we can have better conversations about what's actually happening in a person when they're submitting to whatever experimental paradigm we've concocted. This is a point that I think Francisco Varela made several decades ago about a neurophenomenological approach to studying the mind, right? Where you use the third-person tools of science, and in this case, neuroimaging, but they can be married to more and more sophisticated first-person observers on the other side of the experiment. I think meditation is really an essential piece there. And yeah, so I think that holds a lot of promise.
Hmm. Fully agree. How do you see meditation as this possibility to have conscious control on your thoughts and this process of mental training with what I understood your stand on the illusion of free will?
Well, so yeah, this is actually in part a further answer to the question you just asked, because, some of these core insights that one has at a certain point in meditation, I would argue, bring our first person experience into greater alignment with what we have every reason to believe is true of us from studying the brain, right? So it's pretty obvious when you study the brain that the idea that there is an unchanging subject in the middle of the mind doesn't make a lot of sense. Any kind of functional neuroanatomical description of what the brain is doing does not allow for a homunculus inside that process that gets carried through from one moment to the next unchanged. I mean, at minimum, whatever the self is, it would be a process rather than a thing. It would be a verb rather than a noun at the level of what the brain is doing physiologically. And it's also clear there's no piece of neuroanatomical real estate there. There's no self module. The self is not going to be sitting there in the pineal gland or any other place flying the plane of the conscious mind. So once one experiences this loss of self and just sees that there's just this flow of consciousness and its contents, I would argue that brings our experience into greater conformity with the third person facts about the mind. And this is an analogy I've drawn before. It's somewhat analogous to being able to see the blind spot, the optic blind spot. We know it must be there based on the anatomy of the retina, but we don't see it. But then you can perform this experiment with a piece of paper and a pen, and you suddenly you see it, and then you recognize, okay, that is actually first person data that aligns experience with what we know must be true in the physical body that is underwriting that experience. And so it is with free will. I mean, the problem in philosophy has been that conserving most people's intuitive experience of being a freely willing agent in the world, that has proven a hopeless project. It's just, there is no way to describe the sheer causality of things, whether it's deterministic or random or a combination of determinism and randomness. There's no way to describe this concatenation of events, how one thing follows the next, that leaves a place for the sense of libertarian free will that most people are walking around with and most people mean when they say free will. Now, it's true that there are philosophers of mind, people like Dan Dennett, who have tried to reconceptualize free will in a way that gets around this, and this whole style of philosophy is called compatibilism. But to my eye, they simply change the subject in the end. It's not a solution to the problem. It's a kind of bait and switch where they're not acknowledging that the thing most people think they have doesn't actually exist. I mean, what most people think they have is the real prospect of being able to do other than they did a moment ago. I mean, most people are living with the sense that if they rewound the movie of their lives, this scene that they're now in could have played out differently, right? It's not that it could have played out differently based on noise in the system, random events that determined what happened. No, it could have played out differently because they, as the autonomous source of their thoughts and actions and feelings and intentions, could have decided differently a moment ago. And, I would argue there's no place in the physics of things to make sense of that, and there's no place in the neurophysiology of the brain to make sense of that, which is to say that if we return your brain to precisely the state it was in a moment ago, every single charge at every single synapse is exactly as it was, you will say and think and do and intend the same thing you did a moment ago in perfect conformity to the laws of nature. And again, if you add randomness to the process, well, perhaps that allows for a difference, but that's not the difference people feel they have. You don't feel that your free will is predicated on the universe perpetually rolling dice at the, subatomic level or at any other level, causing you to behave differently than you otherwise would. Again, this is the kind of insight you can have by simply paying closer attention to what it's like to be you in each moment. I mean, the one contribution I've made to this conversation about free will that is somewhat novel, at least in the context in which I've had the conversation, is that this isn't actually a problem that needs to be solved. It's a pseudo problem. It's not that we have an experience of free will that we have to figure out how to reconcile with determinism or any other kind of causality in the world. No, I mean, we actually don't have an experience of free will. It's not there to be found. If you look closely for it, you will see that you don't experience free will and that your experience is totally compatible with the truth of determinism or the truth of determinism plus randomness, which is to say, you don't know what you're going to think next until the thought itself arises, right? You as the conscious agent, whom in other moods might presume to be free to think whatever in fact you want to think, well, the next thought is going to arise whatever you think you may want to think. And you have absolutely no authorship over it. I mean, literally none, because you can't think it before you think it, right? I mean, it simply appears. It appears every bit as much as my next thought will appear to you when I speak it, right? And there are further things to say about the nature of personal identity and, how we make sense of the fact that, you wake up tomorrow morning being you rather than me and all of that. But free will really isn't part of this picture. I mean, just each thing that appears in consciousness and everything that outside of consciousness that is necessary for whatever appears to appear in consciousness, right? All of the unconscious processing, all of this is happening from the point of view of the conscious subject, very much in the dark and totally outside its control. And that's a subjective fact in addition to being an objective one.
Could one not argue that given our current lack of understanding of consciousness, our ignorance when it comes to the neural code of thought, perception, emotion, doesn't permit, I believe, the scientific disproof or rejection of the existence of free will. I think maybe until we have true understanding, scientific understanding of consciousness, it is very hard to say any meaningful things about free will and the such. No?
Well, I would say that free will, I mean, first of all, it's important not to confuse it with other things about the mind that are obviously facts, right? So that, yes, there's a difference between voluntary and involuntary behavior, for instance, right? So we want to be able to conserve that difference in, dispensing with this notion of free will. But, I mean, the problem with this notion of freedom is that the more you press into it, any conceptual basis for it vanishes. Just take the simplest possible case of free will, where I'm asking you to decide between two things, right? And you can take as long as you want, and you can decide for any reason, right? So, like, do you want to have Chinese food for dinner tonight or Italian food? You can literally take 12 hours to make this decision, and you can think about anything you want to think about, right? So it's a circumstance of where there's absolutely no coercion whatsoever. And then just look at how that decision gets made. Free will is nowhere in sight. First of all, there are all the things that are conditioning the decision which you didn't have any control over or any input into, right? I mean, your, genetic and environmental influences that determine how much you like certain tastes or your associations with certain concepts, whether your parents took you to Italy when you were a child, whatever associations you have with different cuisine, right? So there's all of that conditioning, all of that's loaded into the system, right? But even if you were going to just be as existentialist as you could possibly be in that situation and say, well, despite all of my conditioning and all that has led up to this moment, I, as a freely willing agent, am going to make a perverse decision here. I'm going to, the truth is I like Italian food better than Chinese food. I always do, but I'm going to pick Chinese just to prove my freedom in this moment, right?
Of course not, Sam. I'm Belgian. I will go for mussels and French fries.
Right. Okay. Well, I didn't give you that choice. There was some coercion here.
You see, freedom exists.
Yeah. Okay. So, but whatever choice you make, however in character or out of character it is, right? You are in no position to understand why it went the way that it did, right? Like why you found that thought compelling. Like if after hours of deliberation, you thought, you know what, I'm just going to flip a coin, right? Or, you know what, I'm going to do the thing I don't want to do just to prove that I'm free, right? That was a thought that arose that you found compelling enough to put it into action. It became behaviorally effective for whatever reason. But the important part is that it's a reason you as the subject cannot inspect, right? And did not determine. And in another context, it wouldn't have been effective. It had the synaptic weights it had for reasons that you didn't cause. You, the experiencer. You're watching this movie, and you are not actually directing it. I mean, the sense that you're directing it is part of the movie. And again, this is really just the flip side of the coin of the illusion of self. The only reason why free will is a problem that anyone spends any time thinking about is because people feel like they have it. They feel like selves. I mean, it is the obverse of this feeling of being me, being I, being a subject in the head, being a thinker of thoughts. In addition to thoughts merely arising, people feel that they're the thinker of the thought. There's a thinker in addition to the thoughts. Again, this is an illusion that can be directly penetrated through meditation. And this is in answer to your question about how the practice of meditation can help us understand the mind scientifically. It can, because it, in this case, cuts through this seeming impasse. I mean, people are left thinking, well, how can we understand free will at the level of the brain? I mean, there are people who've raised tens of millions of dollars to study free will, right? From my point of view, this is truly a phantom problem. Again, I'm not saying that there's no difference between voluntary and involuntary action or any other thing that might be tangential to this notion of free will, but this is like looking for ectoplasm or looking for the soul or looking for something that we have good reason not to need to look for. And again, it can be experienced that way. I mean, whenever I pay attention to what it's like to be me, there's no place to put this notion of free will. Again, it's not that you don't have ordinary conversations with people or with yourself to motivate human beings to behave differently than they have, right? So like, if I do something that seems like a mistake, or I do something that I regret, or I wish I hadn't done, that's still a phenomenon. I can make sense of that. I can make sense of wanting to do better next time, right? Obviously, that's an important part of improving as a person. But when I actually inspect the process here, there's simply a mysterious flow of causality. And any sense that there's a subject in control of it evaporates. There is simply the next thing that arises, right? So like, let's say I'm on a diet. I want to lose weight. I form this intention to lose weight. This is the quintessential case of implementing one's will toward a purpose and encountering failures of will along the way, right? People will this thing. I'm going to eat nothing but vegetables and protein and abjure all sugar and other, unhealthy things for the next month. But then, 6 hours from now, I find myself, reaching for a cookie, and I'm at, there's this tug of war between seemingly two parts of my own mind. There's the one who wants to lose weight, and there's the one who wants the cookie, and who's going to win, right? And there's the phenomenon of weakness of will is found here. But to inspect this process is to see that in each moment, it is in fact mysterious. There's no one who understands why one intention wins in this Darwinian contest over another in any given moment. If the one who wants the cookie wins, or the one who wants to maintain the diet wins, there's no me that is the agent there, right? There is simply a winner of that particular contest. And that is part of the causal flow of the universe, right? I mean, that is, again, whether there's randomness or it's best understood in purely deterministic terms, there is no one who is free there. There's simply the process. And that can be felt directly. This problem of explaining our freedom of will truly evaporates once you become sensitive to the phenomenology. Even in moments like that which are the prototypical moments of agency and the free exercise of a conscious will. But again, I understand it doesn't feel that way if it doesn't feel that way. Again, that's the mapping onto the experience is, founders for people where they think, well, what the fuck is he talking about? I can do what I want to do right now. Like, watch this. I'm going to pick up this glass of water, right? I did it. That feels a certain way. But what I'm saying is that is what it's like to be thinking without knowing that you're thinking. Right? I mean, you may have an abstract idea that, of course, I know I'm thinking. What is he talking about? I know I'm thinking. But that feeling of self-possession, that's a thought. That's what it's like to be lived by the next thought that arises in consciousness uninspected. That's the condition of having no distance from this feature of the mind and not seeing any space around the flow of thought. It's the identification with thought that feels a certain way, and it feels like a self that has free will and certainly doesn't want to be told that it doesn't have free will.
But you see that there can be voluntary action. So we'll need more science maybe to understand. And again,
let's just explore that. So there's the neurological differences between voluntary and involuntary action, but there's also just the phenomenological difference. I mean, so like with a voluntary action, there are many features to it that are not shared by involuntary actions. I mean, so one, there's some predictive coding going on such that, I mean, this is largely unconscious, but the violations of it are conscious. So when I decide to reach for a glass of water, as I'll do now, I have cheers. I have an implicit, or a subconscious expectation about how that's going to go. I have formed a motor plan, and, I will certainly notice violations of that plan. If I reach for the glass of water and my hand passes right through it because it was just a hologram or something that confused me, right? So it's a glass of water made of light and I can't actually grab it. That violation of my expectations will startle me, right? And it will reveal, if nothing else, that I had those expectations implicitly to begin with, right? So there is some efferent copy of motor expectation here, which is informing the experience of voluntarily engaging this action. And that's not happening when I have involuntary action, like, a muscle spasm or something that causes me to move my hand, without any, motor plan underwriting it. And there's the fact that given all of that and other features of the nervous system, I can be told not to do that. And part of my brain can suppress that behavior because it was voluntarily initiated in the first place, right? So I can decide, okay, I'm not going to reach for the glass of water right now. I can't decide to no longer have a certain kind of tremor if in fact it's a proper, involuntary tremor, right? And that feels different. To see my hand moving and I'm not intending it, right, feels different phenomenologically, and is different neurologically than my deciding to move and then moving precisely when the intention to move achieved a certain degree of salience. And yeah, so these are different, and it's important ethically, obviously, to recognize these differences. I mean, if someone accidentally does something that winds up killing another person, that is different than somebody intentionally killing another person. And it's different because it says many different things about them. I mean, the accident says almost nothing about a person except, perhaps they were more negligent than they should have been. But on some level, if it's a pure accident, right, then really they were unlucky. They were unlucky, and the person who got killed was also unlucky. But somebody who intends to kill a person has a lot going on in their minds that we need to worry about, or we certainly may need to worry about, and is fairly predictive of future behavior in other situations. All of that is no less relevant in a world without free will. If we built a robot that, would occasionally form a behavioral plan to murder people, well, we wouldn't need to attribute free will to that robot in order to worry about it or to want to constrain its behavior, or even want to switch it off, right? And so that's a similar case with I mean, we could build a robot wherein we made this distinction between voluntary and involuntary behavior, and we wouldn't think to smuggle free will into the robot necessarily.
I would disagree.
Mm-hmm.
I think our best, most smart robots full of artificial intelligence are actually not having any thought, perception, or emotion, and are true zombies lacking any voluntary action. So again, there are
well, no, so I would agree. No, I would totally agree with our current robots, but I'm saying if we get to the point of building more and more sophisticated robots, then we could just flip it around. At what point are we going to begin to worry whether or not we have built free will into them? I mean, we've built them. We understand the algorithms that are driving their behavior. If at a certain point we have a robot that, can pass the Turing test, that can behave voluntarily in all the usual ways that people do, what I'm arguing is at no point along the way, having understood this process of building such a robot, will we say, oh, that's the point where we put the free will in.
Yeah, that the future will tell. But my thinking would be it would seem conscious. It would look like it's conscious or having volition, but it would not actually have the experience. But again, it's just illustrating our ignorance, right? Is you mentioned panpsychism, is consciousness limited to humans, as many think, and biologically speaking, that is probably wrong. Or is it limited to mammals or also other animals, or is it limited to living organisms or non-living matter? But yeah, it's fascinating how little we actually know about conscious thoughts. Isn't it?
Yeah.
May I move to you as this scientist with huge faith in science and reading your moral landscape now, what is it, 10 years ago? One could be surprised how how you now talk about meditation and spirituality. How do you combine, manage this very strong belief in science, and here having the spiritual experience?
Well, I have a very strong belief in the primacy of reason in terms of the method by which we form
Uh-huh.
beliefs about the world. I mean, we're trying to, it seems to me, develop a map of reality. In all of our talking about it, thinking about it, exchanging ideas about it, performing experiments so as to refine our sense of what's going on. That whole project of empirical engagement with the world for the purpose of belief formation and perhaps most important for the purpose of falsifying propositions that in the end we'll no longer believe. All of that is trying to develop a better and better map of reality, whatever it is. And part of that mapping extends to the kinds of experiences that are possible. And for me, this is the most important part of the mapping. The real situation that we're in is one in which the possibility of experiencing greater and lesser forms of well-being, as conscious beings in this world, whatever in fact our engagement is with reality itself, there's no question that there's a vast range of pleasant and unpleasant experiences available. And there's also just no question that we want to move away from the worst possible states of misery and pain toward something far more pleasurable, beautiful, interesting, creative, etc. So what we have is a navigation problem. And I think science is a necessary part, in fact, probably the most important part of navigating this space intelligently and understanding just what is it that allows for the most number of people most often to avoid states of pointless unhappiness and to find better and better ways of living. And part of what makes life worth living is also satisfying intellectual curiosity, right? So there is this sort of the purely intellectual satisfaction of curiosity mode in which we do science. And, I wouldn't dispute that, but I do think that on some level, you can't totally step away from the utility of all of this. And you especially can't step away from it when you think about the prospect of learning certain things about the world wherein the mere knowledge winds up harming the prospect of living a good life for everybody, right? I mean, this is something that the philosopher Nick Bostrom has talked about. I mean, he has this analogy of the urn of invention, where we keep reaching into this urn and pulling out various colored balls. And until this moment, we've pulled out only white balls and gray balls. And a white ball is an idea or a scientific invention that is purely good, right? The only benefits follow from it. But far more commonly, we pull out gray balls where, there are good parts to this invention or idea or good implications, but there are also bad ones, right? So we wind up splitting the atom and we get, nuclear power, which is good, but we also get nuclear bombs, which, certainly for most purposes are bad. And much of our scientific understanding has this dual use. Obviously we want to understand the mechanics of viruses and their spread, but, insofar as we really do understand the molecular biology here, well, then we are equipped to weaponize viruses, and bioterrorism now becomes a thing, right? So we're in this position of pulling out, some white balls and a lot of gray balls, but Bostrom asked us to consider the prospect that there might be a few black balls in the urn of invention, which is to say, merely discovering a certain form of knowledge could be, in principle, antithetical to human survival. It's obvious to me that we don't want that knowledge, right? I mean, there may be some crazy purist out there who would dispute this, but if in fact it's possible that there are black balls in the urn of invention, well, then there's certain true facts that, we are wise not to want to know, and we want to navigate around those spots on the landscape of knowledge. So I do think on some level, the well-being of humanity and beyond, I mean, the well-being of any conscious creature is the most important thing, right? It's more important than anything else we're up to, and anything else we are up to that seems important when translated into the currency of well-being, which in the end is a spiritual concern. I mean, spiritual may need to be in scare quotes, given all that people associate with the term, but I think a concern for the well-being of conscious creatures is at bottom it's where ethics and spirituality truly rest, and it does subsume any scientific project in the end for me. I mean, it really is the point of being in this place. Yeah, so I don't think there is a contradiction as long as you would acknowledge that in the end, on some level, truth is subservient to goodness, right? I mean, if you can admit that there are certain things that are not worth knowing, you've tipped the balance ever so slightly in the direction of the good over the true or the beautiful there. But, apart from that, I think they're all of a piece. Whatever ethical or spiritual aspirations we might form in life, there is a right way and a wrong way to pursue those aspirations. And the rightness and wrongness of those ways will be spelled out very much in the language of science. There are neurological reasons why paying attention in certain ways constitutes meditation and paying attention in other ways doesn't. At some level, the explanation for the efficacy of any practice in this area is a neurological one or a neurophysiological one. And so science is the ground truth of any spiritual story in the end. And that's true at every level. There are right and wrong ways to organize a society so that most of the people can live the freest, most creative, least stressful, least harmful, least paranoid, least agitated lives, right? And we know something about this. We don't know everything we want to know about it, but we know that, deciding to decapitate people at halftime at a soccer game, as the Taliban do, isn't the best possible way. And so every human science and almost science, from economics on down, is relevant to this conversation. I don't see that there's any kind of line between spirituality or ethics, rightly understood, and a scientific understanding of what's happening.
Yeah, to me, I personally, and I'm a hard-nosed scientist as yourself, and yet I have the feeling that when looking at the rainbow, the stars, baby being born, and yes, we understand part of the physics and chemistry and biology of these things, but there's so much we ignore at one given point, and then we just, I think, shouldn't be too arrogant as a scientist and maybe look at these things with more wonder, and that to me is maybe the challenge to what to me spirituality can be, is to just acknowledge how much we ignore, and it's well, to me, if I understand you correctly, considering that these big questions and what is the meaning of this life, and is this a purely scientific question, is wow, it's having really a lot of faith in science now.
I think it's possible to misunderstand my claim here, because I fully agree that there's much more to understand about the world than we've understood, and that will probably always be the case. No matter how much progress we make, there'll be an ocean of ignorance that we're standing at the edge of. But that doesn't mean progress isn't really progress, right? I mean, we do make progress. But I would say to you that the awe and the humility are always there to be appreciated, no matter how much progress we make, because on some basic level, understanding the world doesn't reach into its fundamental mystery. There's a fundamental mystery of being that persists even in the presence of things that we more or less totally understand. Right? I mean, like, if I just pay attention to anything, if I look at, again, the glass of water sitting in front of me on my desk, if I really look at it, I recognize that on some level, I don't know what it is. It is fundamentally a mysterious appearance in consciousness. I have a word for it. I can say the word glass. I can recall what I understand about the structure of glass as a generic material in the world, right? I can begin telling myself a story or reiterating a story I've heard about the lattice structure of molecules within glass, but none of that linguistic behavior, whether I do it out loud or I do it covertly in my mind, none of that reaches in to the phenomenon, right? The phenomenology is such that all of our concepts are being applied on top of an experience that is irreducibly mysterious, even in the case where it seems most ordinary and least mysterious, right? So, I mean, obviously, if you take psilocybin, you're confronted with the fireworks of, psychedelic change in the contents of consciousness. So it's easy to see how all of that is awe-inspiring and mysterious. But even the most mundane experience of just simply looking at a glass of water that I myself remember filling, that perception is on some level as mysterious as anything anyone sees at any point in life. Looking up at the Milky Way or dropping acid, or if you actually connect with consciousness as it is in an ordinary moment, it is as mysterious as anything ever is.
Thank you so much for answering all of these questions, and looking forward to see where this brings us, both scientifically, spiritually speaking, and thanks for I really think inspiring many people and making meditation something that is more accessible to all.
Nice. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Stephen. And I know that people listening will want to know more about what you're up to, because this has been an interview of me, but you have tipped your hand that you're involved with all kinds of fascinating things. So can you just reiterate how people can be part of the study on near-death experience and make contact with the other things you're studying?
Yes, thanks for that. With the team, we first of all try to improve our care for the severely brain damaged, but part of that is also the scientific aim to better understand consciousness, including near-death experiences. And so, yes, if anyone listening has or knows someone who had a near-death experience, please share it. Near-death experience, NDE at uliege.be. That's one of the many things we do, including looking at the effects of meditation, hypnosis, and psychedelic drugs. So yes, a lot, as we said, needs to be done there, because it's an area that is actually quite young, and so it's wonderful to with the team be able to participate. to
Hmm.
that big scientific mystery.
I actually have a further question before we sign off. Do you think that offering a track on hypnosis in the Waking Up app would be doable? I mean, I have some experience with hypnosis, but not a lot. Is it the kind of thing where you think we could actually have someone, and perhaps you might be able to recommend someone who could produce a full kind of self-hypnosis or guided hypnosis curriculum within the app?
Definitely. I think that could be a great idea. There's a lot of overlap. As said, we were using hypnosis in a clinical context and actually are now trying to understand, well, what is similar and different between these different meditation exercises and techniques and hypnosis. And it seems to be also in terms of the neural correlates that it is different. But it's definitely for people interested in mental training and a useful tool. And what we classically do in mindfulness, again, we use mental imagery, we use a number of the techniques that are also part of hypnosis. So definitely, yes, I can propose people, or well, would also be happy to talk a little bit about what we do here. Are you using or have you did you try auto hypnosis or any of these techniques yourself?
Yeah, I have very little experience with it. I have a experience that I had actually in freshman year in college where actually before I got into meditation, this was before my MDMA experience, before I had any real interest in these things. I was in Phil Zimbardo's, Introduction to Psychology class at Stanford, and they were doing hypnosis research, and they used the Stanford hypnotizability
Mm-hmm.
scale on the
Mm-hmm.
whole class. And I was, I believe it was a 10-point scale, and I believe I was a 9 in terms of hypnotizability. And I remember what that test was like, and it was pretty fascinating because it was, I mean, the moment I remember, which convinced me that there was something to this, was I was asked to, I don't know if this is the way the test is still conducted, but this seemed to be what they did then. They gave us these various tasks after giving us, after inducting us into a hypnotic state. And one task was, I think they said, okay, you're 9 years old. And they gave us a piece of paper and a pen, and they said, sign your name. And without thinking about it, I mean, there was really, I mean, I was aware that this was a kind of, involuntary change in motor plan, because it just, I was surprised to see that without forming any conscious plan to think about how I would sign my name as a 9-year-old, my hand just signed, in the bubbly cursive writing that was really familiar to me. I mean, I'm sure it looked a fair amount like the way I would sign my name. I signed my name as a 9-year-old. And then they said, and then write the year. And without doing any conscious math, I wrote the correct year of, it would have been 1976. And I was struck by just, this had invoked a part of my mind. It certainly seemed to invoke a part of my mind, which was, it was quite surprising that it was there to be invoked. And so
Mm-hmm.
I've had a few experiences of hypnosis since then, and really have not gotten into the research on it at all. So yeah, I'd be very interested to in a further installment to hear what you think is most useful there. And if you have someone who you recommend to actually guide, sessions in hypnosis, whether it's for mitigating pain or, making any behavioral change or any other purpose. I mean, how you think it would be best implemented in the Waking Up app. I'd love to have that conversation with you and get any recommendations you have.
Yes, wonderful. Because here I had this course, and that's given by the person I mentioned already, Marie-Lise Femonville, but it is in French. And
How is her English?
yeah, well, I think it is good to have a native English
Mm-hmm.
speaker, because language is important there.
Yeah.
Another scholar is from Montreal, Pierre Rainville, a wonderful person also. But I would need to check in terms of, having someone who would actually guide through, because I do think it is complementary. And also within Mind and Life Europe, we recently, part of that, and organized a workshop where, we invited this strong Buddhist tradition there, as you know, these meditation experts to actually experience hypnosis, and I think it's